What happens when a man spends a lifetime becoming dependable, only to discover that dependability doesn't protect you from being replaced? In 2024, Tom Selleck stood at the center of one of television's most enduring dramas. For over a decade, his presence had been steady, almost immovable, a kind of emotional anchor for millions of viewers who tuned in not just for the story, but for the familiarity he represented. His voice, his posture, his quiet authority, they weren't just traits of a character. They were constants in a world that rarely offers any. And then, just months later, that world continued, without him. No grand farewell. No long monologue. No carefully orchestrated goodbye that allowed audiences to prepare themselves emotionally. Just absence. So here's the question. After 50 years of discipline, loyalty, and quiet endurance, what actually breaks first? The career? The body? Or something far more private? Something that no one else ever really sees? Let's go back. Tom Selleck was born in 1945, at a time when the world itself felt uncertain, unfinished. War had not yet ended, and peace was still something people hoped for rather than expected. His early years unfolded in a country that was rebuilding, redefining itself, learning how to move forward again. His family eventually moved west, settling in California, a place that, even then, carried a kind of unspoken promise. There was something about the light, the openness, the sense that life could expand there in ways it couldn't elsewhere. But inside his home, things were far more structured. His father believed in results, clear, measurable outcomes. Effort wasn't enough unless it led somewhere. His mother believed in discipline, the idea that consistency, routine, and responsibility were what shaped a person over time. Together, they created an environment where expectations were high, and excuses didn't carry much weight. Tom grew up in that atmosphere, steady, grounded, quietly shaped by it. He didn't demand attention. He didn't need to. He stood out anyway. Tall, athletic, focused. There was something about him that made people notice, even when he wasn't trying to be noticed. And like many young men with that kind of presence, he believed his path was already clear. Basketball. It wasn't just a hobby, it was an identity. A direction. A future he could see in his mind long before it ever had the chance to become real. He earned a scholarship to the University of Southern California. Walking onto that campus, he carried confidence with him, the kind that comes from years of believing you're exactly where you're supposed to be. But reality doesn't always negotiate with belief. 7 games. 4 points. That was the total. No dramatic failure. No public collapse. Just a quiet realization that the dream he had built himself around wasn't going to hold. So what do you do when the thing you've shaped your identity around simply fades away? Do you resist it? Fight it? Pretend it's still there? Or do you do something far more difficult, accept it, and move forward without knowing what comes next? For Selleck, there was no dramatic turning point. No emotional breakdown that forced him to change direction. Just a shift. A willingness to look somewhere else. That's where acting entered the picture, not as a lifelong ambition, but almost as an accident. A suggestion. A class. A moment where someone saw something in him that he hadn't fully recognized in himself. Presence. Stillness. The ability to say something without saying anything at all. But recognition is not the same as success. The early years were slow, painfully slow. Commercials that barely paid the bills. Small television roles that came and went without leaving much of a mark. Endless auditions where he was either almost right, or not quite what they were looking for. Rejection didn't come all at once. It came in small, steady doses, the kind that quietly tests your patience rather than shattering your confidence outright. And during this uncertain time, another responsibility entered his life. He served 6 years in the California Army National Guard. It was a period shaped by tension. The Vietnam War loomed in the background, casting a long shadow over an entire generation. For many, it was a time of fear, protest, and uncertainty. But Selleck never built a public narrative around his service. He didn't use it to elevate himself. Didn't revisit it in interviews to gain admiration. He simply did it. And carried it with him, quietly. At the same time, his personal life began to take shape. He married actress Jacqueline Ray, a woman who stood beside him during the most uncertain years of his career. Think about that for a moment. Before the fame, before the recognition, before the money or the stability, she was there when nothing was guaranteed. Which raises an uncomfortable question. How many relationships survive the years before success, only to be tested once success finally arrives? Because success changes things. It doesn't just add opportunity, it adds pressure, visibility, distance, expectations that didn't exist before. And not every relationship is built to withstand that shift. By the late 1970s, Selleck's career began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. Small roles became more noticeable. His face started to become familiar. Then came a moment that could have changed everything. He was nearly cast as James Bond. Think about what that means. A single role, a single decision, a single shift in timing, and his entire life might have followed a completely different trajectory. But the role slipped away due to prior commitments. Another actor stepped in. Another career path unfolded. And Selleck, he didn't dwell on it, didn't turn it into a lifelong regret. He moved forward. Which leads to another question. Is resilience about holding on, or about letting go? Then came 1980. Magnum, P.I. Everything changed. Overnight, he became a household name. 60 million viewers. A character that wasn't just popular, it was iconic. The mustache, the Hawaiian shirts, the effortless charm. It all became part of a cultural moment that people still remember decades later. But here's the part that often gets overlooked. When fame arrives that quickly, what does it take with it? Because fame doesn't just give, it reshapes. It alters how people see you, how they approach you, how they expect you to exist in the world. Selleck later described it not as a reward, but as a force, something that moves through your life like a storm, changing everything in its path. And one of the first things it touched was his marriage. He and Jacqueline Ray divorced in 1982. Out of everything he experienced in his career, missed roles, physical strain, lost opportunities, he would later say that the divorce was the worst thing that ever happened to him. Not the roles he didn't get. Not the opportunities that slipped away. The marriage. What does that tell you about what he valued most? And what does it say about the cost of success? Because it didn't just end a relationship, it created distance elsewhere too. His connection with his stepson, Kevin, gradually faded. A bond that had once been strong became something quieter, more distant. And again, it happened without public discussion. Without explanation. Just absence. Meanwhile, his career continued to rise. He won an Emmy. Became one of the most recognizable faces in America. Opportunities came faster than ever. And yet, once again, a defining role passed him by. Indiana Jones. He had been considered. He had been close. But his commitment to Magnum, P.I. prevented him from taking it. So let's pause here. How many people would have walked away from that commitment? How many would have chosen the bigger opportunity over the existing responsibility? Selleck didn't. Because, in his mind, a commitment was a commitment, no matter what it cost. In a world that often celebrates chasing the next opportunity, he chose something different. He chose to stay. But staying has its own consequences. In 1987, a new chapter began. Gilly Mack entered his life, not as a fleeting connection, but as something steadier. Something grounded. Their marriage became the foundation that his earlier life had lacked. Together, they built something away from the spotlight, a life that wasn't defined by cameras or scripts. A ranch in California. 60 acres. Avocado trees. Fences. Land that doesn't care who you are or what you've achieved. Because land demands something different. It demands presence. Consistency. Work that isn't seen or applauded. And maybe that's the point. Because after the cameras turn off, what actually remains? Through the 1990s and early 2000s, Selleck continued working, but his approach had shifted. He wasn't chasing reinvention. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He chose roles that aligned with who he had become. The Jesse Stone films revealed a quieter side of him, a character shaped not by charisma, but by introspection. A man carrying emotional weight without needing to display it dramatically. It was subtle, measured, real. And then, in 2010, another defining role arrived. Blue Bloods. A show built on tradition, family, and moral complexity. At its center stood Frank Reagan, a character who embodied authority without arrogance, strength without aggression. And for over a decade, Selleck played that role with the same consistency that had defined his entire life. No dramatic shifts. No need for reinvention. Just presence. Week after week. Season after season. Which brings us back to 2024. After all those years, after building a reputation on dependability, on showing up, on doing the work, he found himself in a position that few people ever truly prepare for. The story moved on. Without him. And that raises one final question. If a lifetime of loyalty, discipline, and consistency doesn't guarantee permanence, then what does? Because in the end, maybe the answer isn't about what lasts forever. Maybe it's about what remains when something ends. The work. The choices. The relationships that endure beyond the spotlight. And perhaps most importantly, the quiet understanding that even when something disappears, it doesn't erase what came before it. So what breaks first? Maybe nothing does. Maybe some things don't shatter at all. They simply shift. Quietly. Gradually. Almost invisibly. And the real challenge isn't holding on to what was. It's learning how to stand, quietly, steadily, when it's gone. For years, Tom Selleck stood as a symbol of that kind of strength. Not the loud, cinematic kind. Not the kind that demands applause. But the quieter version, the one that shows up every day, does the work, and carries the weight without needing the world to notice. As Frank Reagan, he became more than just a character. He became the moral center of a long-running story about family, duty, and principle. A man who didn't just enforce the law, but lived by a code. For 14 seasons, that role wasn't just performed, it was inhabited. You could feel it in the pauses, the measured tone, the way he listened more than he spoke. But even the longest journeys reach a point where the road splits. In 2024, the show came to an end. And then came the news. A continuation was in the works. Without him. No headlines filled with outrage. No public statements dripping with disappointment. Just something almost unexpected in today's world. Silence. Respect. Professionalism. But let's not pretend that silence means absence of feeling. Can someone truly give 14 years of their life to something, early mornings, long nights, emotional investment, and not feel something when it continues without them? What does that moment feel like when the story goes on, and you're no longer part of it? Maybe that's where the real story begins, not in the spotlight, but just outside of it. Because at the same time, something else was unfolding. Something far more personal. His body, after decades of physical work, on-screen stunts, demanding roles, and life on a working ranch, was beginning to push back. Arthritis had set in. Movements that once felt effortless now required thought. Effort. Sometimes even help. Think about that contrast for a moment. A man known for strength, for presence, for control, now navigating something as humbling as physical limitation. What does it do to a person when their body no longer responds the way it once did? When the simplest actions begin to carry weight? And yet, he kept showing up. Not because it was easy. Not because anyone demanded it. But because that's who he had always been. There's something deeply revealing about that kind of persistence. It doesn't come from ego. It doesn't come from fear of being forgotten. It comes from something quieter, something rooted. So what does resilience actually look like at 80? It doesn't look like perfection. It doesn't look like invincibility. And it certainly doesn't look like a life untouched by struggle. It looks like adaptation. It looks like waking up, knowing things are harder than they used to be, and choosing to move anyway. It looks like accepting change without surrendering identity. It looks like continuing forward, even when the pace slows. And maybe most importantly, it looks like not turning that struggle into a performance. Back on his ranch, far from the structured world of scripts and cameras, life moves differently. Mornings begin early. Not out of obligation, but habit. The work is real, grounded, physical, honest. There's no audience there. No applause waiting at the end of the day. Just routine. Just responsibility. Just life as it is. And in that simplicity, there's something powerful. Something that fame can't replicate. Permanence. Because while roles come and go, while shows begin and end, the land remains. The rhythm remains. The sense of purpose, if it's real, remains. His wife is still by his side. A constant in a world that rarely offers consistency. And his daughter Hannah has carved her own path, not in Hollywood, but in the demanding world of competitive equestrian sports. She didn't lean on his name. She built something of her own. Isn't that, in a way, one of the greatest measures of a life well lived? Not just what you achieve, but what those around you are able to become. And Selleck. He hasn't disappeared. He hasn't retreated into nostalgia or closed the door on what comes next. He's still open to work. Still engaged in conversations about future roles. Not chasing relevance, but also not walking away from purpose. I want to work as long as they'll have me. There's something incredibly honest about that statement. It's not driven by desperation. It's not about clinging to the past. It's about staying connected, to craft, to effort, to meaning. Because what happens when a person stops having a reason to show up? What fills that space? Maybe that's why he continues, not because he needs the spotlight, but because he understands the value of staying in motion. And maybe that's the real story here. Not the missed roles. Not the industry decisions. Not even the physical setbacks. But the consistency. From a young athlete who once scored just 4 points and quietly walked away from basketball, to an actor who lost major opportunities early in his career and kept going, to a man who faced personal loss, physical pain, and professional transitions, without turning any of it into bitterness. That kind of steadiness doesn't happen by accident. It's built, slowly, over years, through choices that no one sees. So let me ask you something. What's harder to carry, the failures everyone sees, or the ones no one ever notices? The public setbacks come with sympathy, with acknowledgement, sometimes even with support. But the private ones, the quiet disappointments, the moments where things don't go your way and no one even knows they happened, those stay with you in a different way. And yet, those are often the moments that shape who you become. Tom Selleck's life suggests something important, that the weight of those unseen moments can either harden a person or refine them. And in his case, it seems to have done the latter. Because through it all, he kept moving forward. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Not in a way that demanded recognition. Just steadily. And maybe that's why his story resonates, especially with those who understand that life isn't about avoiding loss. It isn't about controlling every outcome or holding on to every chapter. It's about continuing. Continuing when things change. Continuing when roles end. Continuing when the body slows down. Continuing when the world quietly moves on. So as you reflect on his journey, consider this. Is real strength about achieving everything you set out to do? Or is it about standing firm, grounded, composed, and unshaken, when so much doesn't go your way? And if the answer isn't as simple as it seems, what does that say about the way we measure success in our own lives? Take a moment. Think about it. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't the ones filled with dramatic victories. They're the ones where nothing breaks. Everything just changes. And someone chooses to stand anyway.